Who was Homer? The authorship of the Homeric poems is a complex and difficult topic, because these written texts emerge from a long oral tradition. Marks of this distinctive legacy are visible in the Odyssey on the level of style. Dawn appears some 20 times in the Odyssey, and the poem repeats the same line, word for word, each time. But when early-born, rosy-fingered Dawn appeared, there is a vast array of such formulaic expressions in Homeric verse, which suggests that things have an eternal, infinitely repeatable presence. Different things will happen every day, but dawn always appears, always with rosy fingers, always early. Characters and objects all have their own descriptive terms in Homer. These are known as epithets rather than adjectives because express an essential quality or characteristic rather than a trait that the object or person possesses only in a particular moment. Ships are black, hollow, swift, or curved, never brown, slow, or wobbly. Chairs are well carved or polished, never uncomfortable or expensive. Penelope is prudent Penelope, never swift-footed Penelope, even if she is moving quickly. Telemachus is thoughtful, even when he seems particularly immature. Moreover, many types of scene follow a certain predictable pattern. There is a fixed sequence of events described with variations whenever someone gets dressed or puts on armor, whenever a meal is prepared, or whenever a person is killed. Though its formulaic mode, the Odyssey through its formulaic mode, the Odyssey assures us that once we know the patterns, the world will follow a predictable rhythm. This feature of the Homeric poems is a mark of their debt to a Greek oral tradition of poetic song that extends back hundreds of years before the poems in their current forms came into existence. In the Odyssey itself, we meet two singers who play the lyre, while they give their performance of traditional tales at the banquets of the rich. The first is Demodocus at the court of King Alcyoneus of Phocaea, who tells stories about Odysseus himself and the Trojan horse, as well as about the affair between the Greek god Ares and the goddess Aphrodite. The second is Phemius, who performs under compulsion for the suitors of Penelope. These characters give us some important insights into the composition of the poem and the person or people who composed it. In an obviously self-interested spirit, the Odyssey suggests that poets have a particularly honorable place in society. But the singer is also presented as a servant, perhaps a slave who earns food and a place to rest by giving performances that are enjoyed by wealthy banqueteers. Demodocus does not read out his poetry from a script. His inability to do so is underlined by the fact that he is blind. Not incidentally, no one in the entire Odyssey reads or writes anything. Moreover, Demodocus does not invent an original story of his own composition. Instead, Demodocus is inspired by the muse to sing the deeds of heroes, which are, at least in the outline, already well known to his audience. The skill and inspiration of these illiterate singers is shown not in the invention of entirely new stories, but in their ability to retell ancient stories and to transport their audience to the scenes they describe. But Homer himself, if there was such a person, was not exactly a Demodocus. A blind, illiterate bard could not by himself have written the monumental Iliad and Odyssey. Homer is usually described in Greek sources not as a singer or rhapsode, song stitcher, but as a poet, poetes, a word that means maker. Indeed, a normal way to refer to Homer in Greek is as the poet. The name Homer can be omitted since there is only one primary poet in the canon. The Odyssey as we know it is based, like most all the Greco-Roman literature we have, on medieval manuscripts, but there is an important difference with this text. The medieval manuscripts of an author like Virgil or Horace are based on earlier manuscripts, based in turn on earlier manuscripts, and so on, each scribe copying the work of a predecessor and moving back from the medieval codex, a leaved book written on animal skin or parchment, to the Byzantine and then ancient papyrus, a scroll written on a kind of thick paper made from papyrus leaves. The Odyssey and the Iliad are different, not only because they are older than other ancient tales, but because of the specific difficulties of understanding how these poems were created. Not, or not simply, from the mind of an individual creator, but also from a long oral tradition which has been transformed into two monumental written texts. How exactly did this process happen? Did a single, particularly talented folk poet learn to write, or did an illiterate singer collaborate with scribes? Was there one creator or many? At what time in the process of composition did writing enter the picture? This takes us to what is known as the Homeric question, which is really a whole cluster of questions about the composition of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The question is given a capital Q because scholars still disagree on some crucial issues, even after a couple of centuries of discussion. How exactly did the Homeric poems as we have them emerge from oral tradition that preceded them? Who was Homer? Was there a single author of the Odyssey or several? Did the same person produce the Iliad and the Odyssey? When exactly did the poems get written down, and how? Can we trace earlier and later parts of the poems, or tie particular passages to different geological locations? And to what extent do the poems reflect real historical events, cultures, and peoples? A real Trojan War or the real Mycenaean civilization of late Bronze Age Greece, which existed from the 16th to the 12th centuries BCE? More generally, how exactly did multiple people over hundreds of years across the Greek speaking world work together to create this magnificent, challenging, and coherent work of poetic storytelling? Design by committee has a very bad name, and yet the Odyssey seems like an unexpected success. How was it done? During the Renaissance, when the Homeric poems were rediscovered in Europe, Homer was assumed to have been a writer, in the same way that Virgil or Dante were writers, albeit a writer from an ancient time. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, dissenting voices began to emerge. In 1664, the Abed Abuna, de Abuna attacked Homer, arguing that the Iliad and Odyssey were incoherent, immoral, and tasteless poems, cobbled together out of an oral folk tradition. A generation later, the British scholar Richard Bentley studied Homer's language and proved that it was much earlier than classical 5th and 4th century Greek because it was still showing traces of a letter of the alphabet that dropped out of the language, the digamma. Bentley argued that Homer was a prehistoric oral poet of about 1000 BCE, whose disparate and prehistoric and rambling songs were not gathered into epics we have until the late 6th century. Scholars began to apply new methods of historical and linguistic analysis and to ask new questions about how and when these texts were produced. In his Prolegomena, to Homer of 1795, a pioneering work in this new philosophy, Friedrich August Wolff argued that the Homeric poems were transmitted orally and that they had undergone a long period of change and adaptation through multiple oral performances and multiple reformulations by literate editors to suit changing contemporary tastes. He suggested that the poems, which he saw as the product of the whole Greek people, were forged into their state of apparent unity only at the stage of transcription. Wolff's new vision initiated a fresh discussion of how the original Homer, or the original building blocks of the poem, may have been uncovered out of the text as we have it. During the 19th century, Homeric scholarship was divided between the analytic and Unitarian schools. The Unitarians opposed Wolff's ideas, largely on literary grounds, and argued that the poems as we see them are not an aggregate of earlier, shorter compositions, but were composed by a lone author with a single overarching structure in mind. The analysts, by contrast, argued that the epics were produced by many different hands. There were multiple theories about how exactly the compilation took place and what the original kernel may have been. Some argued that there was an original core narrative, an Odyssey, which had been encrusted with many layer and clumsier accretions. Their scholarly test was to strip away the layers of later sub Homeric narrative and restore the original purity of the poems. Others believed that the poems as we have them are a compilation of originally separate folk stories welded together. The analysts shared the view that the earlier, more original layers of the poems were superior to the later additions and edits, although they disagreed about where exactly the original Homer could be located in the poems as we have them. Even in more recent times, Homerists have been slow to shake off the notion that earlier means better, as well as to get rid of themselves to rid themselves of the hope that one might chisel a more perfect poem out of the rough marble of the text we have. Up until the start of the 20th century, scholars took the oral roots of Homeric poetry more or less for granted, not fully understanding the degree to which they can help us explain important features of Homeric style and narrative technique. The emergence of Homeric poetry from folk traditions explain its primitive style, but the generic and stylistic structures of oral poetry and folk traditions were not examined in a systematic way. The state of Homeric scholarship changed radically and permanently in the early 1930s when a young American classicist named Milman Parry traveled to the then Yugoslavia with recording equipment and began to study the living oral tradition of illiterate and semi literate Serbo Croat bards who told poetic folk tales about the mythical and semi historical events of the Serbian past. Perry died at the age of 33 from an accidental gunshot, and research was further interrupted by the Second World War. But Perry's student Albert Lord continued his work on Homer and published his findings in 1960 under the title The Singer of the Tales. Lord and Perry proved definitively that the Homeric poems show the mark of oral composition. The Perry Lord hypothesis was that oral poetry from every culture where it exists has certain distinctive features, and that we can see these features in the Homeric poems, specifically in the use of formulae, which enable the oral poet to compose at the speed of speech. A writer can pause for as long as he or she wants to ponder the most fitting adjective for a particular scene. She can also go back and change it afterwards on further reflection, as in the famous anecdote about Oscar Wilde, who labored all morning to add a comma and who worked all afternoon taking it out. Oral performers do not use commas and do not have the luxury of time to ponder their choice of words. They need to be able to maintain fluency, and formulaic features make this possible. Subsequent studies, building on the work of Perry and Lord, have shown that there are marked differences in the ways that oral and literary literate cultures think about memory, originality, and repetition. In highly literate cultures, there is a tendency to dismiss repetitive or formulaic discourse as cliche. We think of it as boring or lazy writing. In primarily oral cultures, repetitions tends to be more highly valued. Repeated phrases, stories, or tropes can be preserved to some extent over many generations without the use of writing, allowing people in an oral culture to remember their own past. In Greek mythology, memory is said to be the mother of the muses because poetry, music, and storytelling are all imagined as modes by which people remember the times before they were born. It is now generally agreed that in broad terms, Perry and Lord were right. Many features of the Homeric poems are indeed formulaic, such as the standard epithets and those formulaic type scenes of arming or eating, and must have originated from an oral tradition. But there is still a very wide range about how exactly the words of many generations of illiterate and semi literate bards turned into the written text of Homer that we have. Several essential factors need to be accounted for by any viable theory. Most obviously, the Homeric poems are written texts, not oral performances. Writing must have played a central part in the process of composition. So it is very misleading to describe the Odyssey simply as an oral poem, as it is far too often done. It is a written text based on an oral tradition, which is not at all the same as being an actual oral composition. Moreover, these texts are far too long for any singer to perform them on a single occasion, and far too long for any individual to hold in memory without the use of writing. Songs that had an influence on the Homeric poems were sung for hundreds of years in pre-literate Greece, but none of them was the Odyssey. These are written texts that display the legacy of a long oral tradition. In important ways, the poems are a patchwork. The language is a mismatch of several different dialects, which marks the fact that the Greek singers and storytellers lived and developed their legends in multiple different locations across the Greek speaking world. Moreover, there are small inconsistencies in the narrative itself, which usually pass unnoticed by the casual reader, such as a slight confusion about how many cloaks Eumaeus possesses, and an apparent switch in who sets up the axes for the contest, in which the suitors and Odysseus compete for Penelope's hand. The inconsistencies could mark the text's emergence from multiple different earlier versions of the story of Odysseus, or they might suggest multiple stages of composition and revision, by one poet or by many. Yet, despite their mixed language and despite the few inconsistencies, both the Iliad and the Odyssey display striking structural coherence. There is a grand architecture to the storytelling, which might seem to imply the careful planning of a single architect or architects. It is possible, as Albert Lord argued, that an oral poet worked closely with a literate scribe or scribes over the course of many days, weeks, or months. On this model, the composition of the Odyssey may not have been so different from that of Paradise Lost, composed by a blind poet who dictated his work over a long period to a number of amanuenses. Lord and Perry thought that the composer of the poem could not have been literate because, in the Yugoslavian context, singers who acquired literacy tended to lose their ability to compose oral poetry. But it has now been shown that oral traditions, or orature, can interact with literacy in a number of different ways, and they are not necessarily driven out as soon as literacy arrives. In Somalia, for example, oral poets have been able to continue their oral compositions even after acquiring literacy. Oral literacy is more diverse than Perry, with a single point of cultural comparison, could discern. Some scholars argue that the Odyssey was composed by a single person who was well acquainted with the oral tradition but had become literate. This is certainly possible, but there is really no evidence one way or the other. Alternatively, perhaps the poem was composed when one particularly talented, illiterate, or semi literate poet, or several, teamed up with a scribe or a group of scribes. Perhaps the scribe or scribes were entirely passive in the process of writing down what the poet composed, or perhaps there was an ongoing collaboration between two or more members of a group. Again, it is difficult to adjudicate between these various possibilities in the absence of any solid evidence or a time machine. The same person could, in theory, have composed the Iliad and the Odyssey, though many scholars believe that different individuals wrote the two poems because they are notably different in terms of language as well as narrative context. It certainly seems like the person or people who composed the Odyssey were aware of the Iliad, since the Odyssey supplements but does not repeat any incidents from the Iliad, which is unlikely to have happened by chance. Scholars who claim the Odyssey was composed by a single person acknowledge that this poet drew on a long and complex set of earlier poetic and folkloric traditions, and that the initial composition underwent considerable alteration in subsequent years, decades, and centuries. Homer, whoever he, she, or they may have been, composed this definitive version of the homecoming of Odyssey with a deep awareness of multiple different versions of the story, as well as a deep knowledge of multiple other parallel folk traditions and myths. For instance, there were probably versions of the story in which Penelope was aware of Odysseus's plans to slaughter the suitors at a much earlier age, and thus proposed the contest of the bow in full knowledge that it would help further her husband's plot. The Odyssey is also influenced by other related archaic legends, originating both around the Mediterranean and the Near East. For instance, the ancient myth of Jason and the Argonauts seems to hover behind the story of Odysseus and his wanderings. Maybe an individual genius, a Homer, had a particularly important role in the creation of the Odyssey. But we should question the notion that a unified structure and coherent creative product most necessarily be seen as the result of an individual's work. Scholars have tended to assume so because many long form narrative genres that we are familiar with, like novels, are produced that way. However, we are also familiar with long narratives that do not have single authors. Many movies, for example, are the product of a team. Most contemporary long form television drama series are put together by multiple people, even if there is a single creator who came up with the show's initial premise. It may be helpful to think in these terms when considering the authorship of the Odyssey. Perhaps we are more prepared than readers of the past to approach the Odyssey as a poem that exists as a mostly unified whole, but which was created by multiple different people over a long period of time.